Edge of Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion, occasionally dealing with mature topics.
Alright everybody, welcome back to the Edge of Chaos. I'm Neurotoxin, here with Joe Ryan.
Howdy.
So, Joe, I understand you went to Texas this last weekend, which is why we didn't have a show. So, is Greg Abbott's campaign still going?
Unfortunately, yeah, that little rat bastard, he's still running, but we tried our best to sabotage that little sumbitch.
So you're coming back to us a failure, is what you're telling me, Joe.
Apparently, it actually lost the right to this accent, so I have to go back to this because of my failure. I was drummed out of the order. So.
There you go. Pretty much, yeah. Joe went over, tried to get into Texas politics. Didn't really work out. Better luck next time.
I think they called me one of them dang California liberals when I was out there. I'm not sure quite what that means, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah, what's a California liberal? Isn't there an initiative here in California to separate California into 6 states?
Yeah, actually, isn't there? I don't know if that's actually... I think I saw one of those guys at the grocery store with the donation box for that recently, which was like, wow, somewhat more maybe legitimate, but maybe not. That's a little strange. But.
Yeah, it's actually real. So, in any case, now that we've had our comic relief and our apology for having been away for a couple of weeks, we have a very interesting topic for you folks today, a topic that some of you may have not heard of. And the topic is Chinese shadow banking.
And no, it's not an Alex Jones thing. No, I thought that too when he said...
There's not like bankers lurking in the shadows, recording your every move with little lizard cameras, and then reporting it to the aliens through whom it comes back to the Vatican and then back to Wall Street. No, it doesn't work that way. That's not what shadow banking is. So, shadow banking. This is kind of an interesting idea. It's nothing new, really. It's actually archaic. It's very similar to the way banking was practiced in the United States in the first kind of era of the Federal Reserve, starting in 1913 when it was introduced, and up until the Glass-Steagall reforms post-Great Depression, so for about 20 years. So what it is, of course, China really doesn't have private banks the way we think of private banks. It has one national central bank, the Central Bank of China, or the People's Republic Bank, whatever it's called. It's the Central Bank of China.
I thought actually that there were 4. There's like an agricultural bank. There's like a trust bank. There's 4. I read.
No. There's not 4. It's just like the Federal Reserve has 12 branches. This has different branches, but it's not. They're not regional. The Federal Reserve branches are regional. These are not regional. They are by sector, but they're all one entity. It's a government entity. It's not a private bank. The Federal Reserve is way more private than they are. So what this bank does, just like any other bank, it has monetary policy and all that. The thing is, their monetary policy is archaic. It's the monetary policy we had before the Great Depression. So they can bail out other banks. They can print money and give it to, well, not really even banks, but to failing entities and to their own basically smaller branches, but they cherry pick who they want to do that to. They don't really have interest rates, and they don't really have like bond measures and QE the way we do in the United States. This is very complicated. It's difficult to explain, but that's the basics. So basically, it's all about they let it fail, and then they bail out who they want. We think we were bad at with that in this country, but at least the Federal Reserve has some proactive measures that it tries to implement. In China, they do not have that. So what they've had in the last, I want to say 15 years, starting about with the dot-com boom and going into our housing boom and all that, is they've had what's called the shadow banking industry because they can't call themselves banks. But these are private companies that borrow money from the central bank, which they lend it out at almost zero interest. So very, very low interest loans. And they invest these loans, they invest this money into private corporations that are popping up in China. You think there's no private enterprise in China, you're wrong. A lot of it's foreign-owned, and it's not called private enterprise, but it's there. So it's these little companies that pop up everywhere, kind of like we had the, not even the banks, but the, the mortgage brokers in the U.S.
Right.
10 years ago? Same idea. And it's the same thing that happened in Russia in the 90s. It's the same thing that happened a lot in this country in the 1920s. So let's say I'm an entrepreneur in China, and I'm probably not from China, maybe from Hong Kong, not from mainland China. And I go and I borrow $100 million from the Chinese central bank at just an interest rate that's almost negligible, like 0.5%. And I take it and I invest it in this company, right? Basically give it all to them, and I say, okay, you're going to pay me back $150 million over the course of the next 5 years. That's a normal business loan, right?
Right.
With all the mortgage and all that. So they start working. I've got some young entrepreneurs, some young Chinese family that actually wants to make it. They're starting a business, but they have no fucking clue how to run a business. I know they're going to fail. Okay? And then I turn around and I say, hey, Joe, check it out. I got this company. They're kicking ass. They're promising. Look, they're going to pay me back $150 million. Okay? Do you want to buy the future of this company? You want to buy it for $110 million? And you'll get 150 in 4 and 5 years, $400 million in profit, Joe. Come on, you're going to be the man. You're a big dick player. It's going to be hanging past your knees. It's like everything's bigger in Texas, right?
Apparently.
So I find some poor sap that I can sell, and again, I don't just sell one mortgage security, right? Or security exchange. Or exchange security. I package the shitty ones with the good ones, just like we did in the 1920s. This is something very familiar about all this. And I sell them to people. I sell you these packages, and then I take your $110 million. I give the bank back their $100 million, or like their $101 million with what I owe them, right? And I pocket my $9 million, and I'm out of here.
It sounds, and actually, when you were saying the 1920s, I mean, isn't this exactly what we were doing up till 2008 when everything exploded here? It sure sounds like only with home loans. Seems like the difference.
Sort of. We only did it with
all these people. They're not going to default on their mortgages. Hey, they live there. Why would they do that? Buy all these securities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Up shit like it is sterling silver.
Exactly. It's similar, only we only did it with the housing market, whereas in the 20s we did it with business. We did it with enterprise. We did it with everything. That's the difference, and they're doing it with everything. It's not a housing market.
It's an age-old thing. Yeah.
Right. This is speculation. And then, so I'm out of here. I'm gone. I'm going to a different country. I'm going to an offshore zone. You are not going to find me and my money. Okay? Then 5 years later, my homeboy business person is bankrupt. And so are you, because you own the future in his business.
Right.
So this is what's happening. And, there was all this growth in China. Actually, right as we had our housing boom, there was this intense growth in China. In fact, a lot of our economy, a lot of our stock market is invested in China, in Americans that are operating in China, because they had something like 12 to 15% GDP growth per year. I mean, it's insane, even for a country the size of China. It's insane, that much growth. And of course, every idiot with a crayon that was, drawing this line, look how fast they're going to keep going up, right?
Yeah, that's what they said about housing growth here. Right.
Okay, what I want to know is, where does anyone get this idea that just because a trend has been going on for some time, that's an indicator it's going to keep going on? That's the number one fallacy of economics. Well, this is what's been happening for the last 10 years. So fucking what?
Trends take a long time to sort of manifest sometimes, yeah, or things take a long time to correct themselves. And I remember the friend looking up something about the housing boom. It's almost like an 18 to 20 year cycle, like clockwork, when you look back the last 120 years or so. So yeah, anyone going, oh, it's just going to keep going up. No.
Right, if you just cherry pick that little piece of 10 years where they're going up, it's going to look like it's going up indefinitely. If you look at the 10 years before, it's like, oh shit.
Yeah, my favorite version of this is an old scene in The Simpsons where there's a guy named Disco Stu at this trade show with a graph behind him of disco record sales starting 1970 and going up to 1976. Disco record sales were up 300% in 1976. If these trends continue, hey!
Exactly.
Yeah, about that.
Let's talk about that little conditional.
Right. Yeah, 3 years later they were burning records in stadiums and saying disco sucks everywhere. So there you go.
Right, and that's kind of what's about to start happening to Chinese shadow banking. So what's going on there now, and their growth has shrunk. They're still growing, but I believe they're down to like 5 or 6% now, which is a huge
still pretty brisk, yeah, if you think about it.
What'd you say?
But it's still pretty brisk if you think about it.
Well, okay, it's slowing down though. Here's the thing. If I am an investor and I took the risk, I took that loan that we're talking about with the impression that they're going to grow at 12% a year and they're down to 5%, I'm losing money.
Then you're what's known in the common parlance of the English language as a moron.
Yes.
That, I'm just saying, not you specifically, but anyone who thought that, yeah, definitely, yeah, sure.
Here's the thing.
That's realistic and definitely.
It's not that they're a moron. necessarily. It's that there's someone that does not understand investment, and they do not understand economics. I don't even claim to understand this fully, neither do you. We're not professionals at this.
Completely not, but just on its face, that one's like, I don't think I'm going to do that, no.
But the thing is, you have people who are not morons. You have people that are like their modern version of snakeskin and wonder tonic peddlers that go around selling this shit to people. Just basically to, well, look, record sales went up 300%, like that guy.
Yeah. Well, there's a sucker born every minute, so just do that math. Every minute times how many suckers. Yeah, I can sell my product to enough people to make a bundle and retire, sure.
I'm telling you, we're in the wrong business. We could have had $8 million each, and we could have been, living offshore by now. This is, this is what it's selling, and it's the same problem that we always talk about on this show: is people just not being able to tell objective reasoning from a train wreck. This happens in politics with pundits. This happens in economic with these mortgage brokers and securities brokers. It's like just because they show you a bunch of numbers and a pretty graph doesn't mean they know their ass from a hole in the ground.
Correct.
It's not rocket science. So going back to our little discussion. So what happens, of course, we know that basics of banking, basics of monetary policy, the amount of money that's in the economy, actual money, fluctuates. It's not always the same. And when that amount of money shrinks, there's deflation, and people start going out of business because they can't afford, basically, like money becomes more expensive. So deflation means prices grow. People can't afford to pay for shit anymore. So, and then if you have unions and you have fixed wages, which we'll get into that shortly, then you have to end up laying people off because you can't reduce their wages, because you can't sell your product at the same price. It just causes this big economic mess. This is what happens. This is every time we have a collapse. Prices go down. So, I'm sorry, don't go up. They go down because money becomes worth more, and you can't afford to pay people. It's just, this is what happened. This is what happened every time. It's what happened during the Great Depression. It's what happened in 2008. So, and on the contrary, banks print money and they hand it out because if you have more money, people will invest it. That's why you're trying to stimulate growth. But a lot of times all you're stimulating is inflation if you don't do it right.
Right.
So this is, basics of monetary policy. We can talk about ulterior motives and why it doesn't work in a different show. That's not what we're here for. So what's happening in China right now? One article I read a couple weeks ago, a little more than that, like a month ago, said that 60%, think about that number, 60, of the Chinese economy, of Chinese economic growth, depends on shadow banking.
Yeah. Well, because and I just correct me if I'm wrong. I was kind of researching this morning. That because of the tight controls, like you were saying, like a la the USSR, whatnot, it exists to fuel that demand, right? To have, like, the demand is still there. You don't clamp down on it with regulation, and thus this shit pops up around to serve that need, right?
Okay. I'm not here to claim that I know exactly how Chinese banking regulations work because I don't. I'm not an economist. I do know that when you make the comparison to Russia and the USSR, the problem isn't a regulation or absence thereof. It's the some animals are more equal than others effect. Where even though China has very tight regulations on who's supposed to receive these shadow loans and what they're supposed to demonstrate and how they're supposed to be monitored and what they can and can't do, if your uncle works for the right agency, you can get around this no problem. Laws don't do anything if they're not enforced. And we have this cronyism, and this good old boy problem on Wall Street, big time. But it's nothing compared to what it is with Chinese shadow banking. So what we're having happen with China is when loans default, which is what's happening, businesses disappear. The loan defaults, so now the person I sold that security to is bankrupt. Now there's just plain less money. There's plain less money in the economy. And the central bank has bailed out a few of these shadow organizations, but if you just keep printing money, you destroy the value of your currency. You can't just keep doing that. So what I'm saying is China is actually approaching this massive Great Depression-style crash. It's not there yet, but it's on the horizon. And again, you can link this back to the global crash from 2008 or whatever. China is a production economy, right? We're the consumption economy. Europe is the consumption economy. When our consumption markets shrunk, when we started buying less shit, because, all our housing speculation went down the toilet, that also really hit their growth. So a lot of their growth was actually tied to our housing bubble, But this was sold to investors on, oh, this is going to keep growing. It's just the 1920s all over again, really. Was it Herbert Hoover, I think, that said, or was it, no, it wasn't Calvin Coolidge. It was either Hoover or Harding that said, we've entered an age of perpetual prosperity.
I forget which one, but I remember the.
I think it was Hoover. Yeah, it was right as he was running for president. Yeah, famous last words.
And I mean, it makes sense, the housing boom of buildings shit. We were importing a lot of Chinese products to do that, Absolutely. So in a lot of ways, we were stimulating. They were getting rich off kind of our bubble too. It was transferring over to them to some degree. And then when we needed debt service, we went over there, and there you go. Then the financial system explodes.
So we just basically decided that as far as China goes, we're going to die together.
And the one thing I was reading, here's two things that I know. It's not like a topic I'm expertise on, obviously. So a knowledgeable patron can feel free to correct us later on. But two things I was reading that are concerning is the massive kind of bubble-inducing pet projects that they've been doing, like building these entire metropolitan cities complete with skyscraper apartment buildings and whatnot that have no one living in them.
In China, you mean?
Yeah, and then the fact that a lot of these, I guess the common term I saw was WMP, the wealth management product. These are these like loans you were talking about, but they're loans after they've been kind of packaged up.
Yep.
They're a fund consisting of like a lot of these loans all kind of together, but a lot of them, people invest in them. It's sort of like how people would buy mortgage-backed securities in packages, thinking, oh, it's on
a roll.
It doesn't matter. But some of these are invested in things that are not going to turn a profit, like infrastructure projects or companies that are just doomed to fail. And you're buying shit like it's sterling silver. Like I said,
essentially,
it's concerning. So
now the thing about China, and I do know quite a bit about like the society of China. She had a Chinese professor in social work school for like policy classes, so she explained to us a lot about like Chinese stratification. And in China, of course, you have the elite, which is the political elite. There's no free market. There's no real economic elite by itself. But it's sort of reminiscent of the USSR. You have this political elite, and in sharp contrast to the USSR, they're very closely tied to foreign investors, to European investors, Japanese investors, US investors. That's basically, you have to grease their palm to invest in China. There's very little domestic industry. So these are the people getting rich off of this. They're the people taking a huge cut off whatever profit U.S. corporations make. All that, oh, we're communist, we're for the people. No, that's just them blowing hot air. That's not how they work. Now, then you have, on the outskirts of China, and we're not talking like way out there in the corners. We're just talking anywhere. It's not a major city where there's little tourism. It's basically far away from Beijing and Shanghai. And, of course, China's a big place.
Very big.
And a lot of it, it's not quite as big as Russia, but it's big. And a lot of it is not very developed. So unless you're in that little central hub, I mean, if you are in that little central hub, it's very easy to ignore everything going on around you. Which, if you think about Russia, it's very similar. I've talked about this multiple times, how you have Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are these beautiful, gleaming in gold cities where life is actually pretty decent. And you travel 30 miles outside, and you're literally in the 19th century. It's that
right. It feels like, you didn't just go way in distance. You travel back a couple hundred years in time. It's
pretty much.
And it hasn't changed much from, it's very much like it was hundreds of years ago.
Now, Russia has invented the time machine. Well, China is very much the same way, only it's less agricultural. I mean, there's agriculture, it's more industrial. So you travel out to peripheral cities in China, and literally, again, you're more like early 20th century, you're like maybe late 19th, you're in the Gilded Age, smog and pollution and homeless children. It's disgusting.
That's starting to bleed into Beijing. I mean, just their air pollution problem right now with all the coal plants. That's a different show, different topic. But
you mean you can't keep the smog in that part of the country that we don't care about anyway?
Force field protecting our little metropolitan bubble from the industrial shithole we built around it to support it? Wow.
Yeah, they need to call the industrial tycoons of the 1910s in New York. They have the time machine and all that.
Yeah.
Ask them how that works out.
Where it's like, China, where every newborn infant is a 2-pack-a-day cigarette smoker equivalent,
Pretty much.
And it's bad. It's actually not a joking matter. It's bad.
It's really not. So you have,
if that's how Beijing is, you can only imagine the places where less people who give a shit are, right? I mean, I'm just saying.
Oh, yeah. Now,
that's their biggest city. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's got to be bad. rest.
So you have that, you have, as you go further out, it gets worse. You're more like mid-19th century, where you have mines and things where there is a lot of raw material production in China. It's just far away from the hub, and the working conditions are just abysmal there. It's supposed to be a communist country. They're supposed to be for labor, right? And I'm not a fan of communists, but there's labor rights. There's such a thing as, rights to being treated decently by your employer, rights to unionize and whatnot. But the unions here are, if they're even there, are in bed with the government. They're in bed with the corporations. So they hire these rural peasants that probably don't even speak the same dialect of Chinese as their employers. And they basically slave away until they die of black lung disease, and then it's their children. So this, the reason Chinese production, Chinese labor is so affordable, this is why. Because there's not one China, there's actually more like three.
When you have that problem of not giving a shit, I don't have that issue,
There's no accountability. And development is a huge problem with this, because those peasants and those workers working in those mines have no way of getting to Beijing and kicking the person's ass that's causing this.
Well, isn't that what happens? You were talking about, like, if we're dealing with the rich businessman in charge, not the actual workers that are a couple of degrees removed slaving away. So.
Right, we're not even dealing with him. We're dealing with the Chinese bureaucrat, very high-level Chinese bureaucrat, who's dealing with the local tycoon, who's dealing with the slave driver, who's dealing with the slaves. It's great. We're completely enslaved. We don't have to think about where the shit we wear, the shit we're buying comes from. It's awesome.
Right.
And there's countries like Bangladesh, where the same shit happens, right?
That's where a lot of clothes are made, Right.
But I'm not saying this is an advantage, but one of the kind of the positives there is this is all out in the open. You go to Bangladesh, or even in most parts of India, and you will see this. It's not hidden from you. It's like, wow, this sucks. This is disgusting.
And didn't they just have like a massive building collapse in Bangladesh, and like their main capital city? It was like a 13-story building. It just completely collapsed on itself, and a bunch of people were trapped and killed. That's called we lied to the exits. There was no way out.
That's called we lied to the constituents. We bribed the inspectors. Now what do we do about gravity? That's what that is. This shit happens in Russia all the time too, so it's familiar. It's like, just because on paper it says it was renovated and the inspector signed it, someone forgot to tell the forces of nature that.
Yeah, you can wipe your ass with that paper.
Exactly. Yeah. The thing is, so in Bangladesh, everyone understands the corruption. Those countries, and one of the reasons kind of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they have a bad reputation because the corruption is so out in the open. The culture accepts it. They know it's there, and a lot of folks are you know what? There is no other way. This is the only development we can get. We need the foreign investment. We're overpopulated. We're underdeveloped. We need this. Yeah, it sucks, but we need it. Otherwise, it would be a little rural agrarian country that doesn't get anywhere. China, on the other hand, has this top-down mentality that they have to look pretty. They have to look like they're this successful world power, which is the same problem the USSR has.
Yeah.
Right, it's the exact same problem. It's autocratic, top-down organization. And actually, India and even Bangladesh, they're making strides in becoming more accountable. I'm not saying it's a nice place, but it's actually making progress because it acknowledges it has this problem. China just sweeps it under the rug, like, no, that doesn't exist. Because that's 2,000 miles away in some little village that doesn't. We don't even really consider them Chinese. They're this kingdom that we conquered 400 years ago.
It's really China, yeah.
There's also a lot of ethnic strife within China. There's nobody really, not nobody, but a lot of them don't really consider themselves Chinese. They consider themselves whatever part of China that they're from, and they all don't like each other. And there's a lot of ethnocentrism within China. People don't acknowledge that, but it's
if you're from Hong Kong, you say you're from Hong Kong. You don't say you're from China.
Well, Hong Kong is a special case altogether. But even like Manchuria versus Canton versus Macau, like even places within China. So where I'm going with all this, when you're said about like them building up these pretty metropolitan areas, well, yeah, one, it's for foreigners. Mm-hmm. Two, they actually have somewhat of an urban middle class, and that's like the guy one step down from the bureaucrat, right? So those people, if you think about it, that class is the most dangerous to the elite because it's right there in Beijing. Mm-hmm. And if one day they realize that what they're just breathing, just basically acid smoke, and all this development, it really isn't there. It is on the class. They'll just go bludgeon you to death. There's no, even China is not known for violent rebellion, but it can happen. So where I feel like China is heading, and I've made this point for a while, and people are like, "Oh, you're crazy, Toxin." Well, now it's starting to materialize. It's heading toward disintegration, because if things get bad enough in these peripheral villages, they will rebel, and they don't have work, they don't have investment because there's no consumption market for it. They will rebel. And the urban middle class is spoiled by all these bullshit infrastructure projects that nothing is backing. They will rebel. So, I mean, this is how the USSR collapsed. And this is kind of, I feel like, where we're heading with China and with the shadow banking. And, shadow banking is just, it's kind of the ghost backbone of all this that's not really there. That's why it's a shadow banking.
It will be. I mean, I have had concerns just based on just the things that I've read about, things slowing down, but the breakneck pace of everything. Anytime it read like they were 5, 6, 7 years behind where we were, just in terms of like the kind of bubble they were trying to blow. And that whole the good times are going to keep on being good attitude, and then like the ignorance of some analysts going, well, they have all these really tight controls on their money, and the whole 20% rule, how they have to keep 20% on deposit for every 80% they loan out. There's that's the highest in the world. So there's a certain solid foundation to their system and all that shit. You know what? That's just when you include, like you were saying, all this other money that's in the system that isn't accounted for. It paints a different picture.
Not only that, but those regulations don't do anything because nobody follows them.
Well, right. If you're
routing, right.
Those ones that I read had this nice little kind of a flowcharty graph of, okay, here's a lump sum of money that gets loaned out in the traditional way and how it can grow by the law and how it can multiply itself. And here it is if it spends all its time getting plowed back into these WMPs. And at the end, you have like almost double the amount of money for the same level of transactions.
Yep.
It's like, well, which one is someone going to try to do? It doesn't make the money real, but it does blow this wealth bubble, and that's exactly what's going on.
Exactly, and
7, 8 years ago.
Right, the currency, basically the amount of currency shrinks. That's when the bubble bursts, and then there's what we're talking about.
Because that's what happened this way. This wealth that people thought they had, it evaporated in like a few days.
Right, and then people...
It wasn't real. It wasn't based on anything. It was all like a promise of a promise of a promise of a promise that someone invested in, and it was shit shined up like.
Yeah, it's literally if promises were dollars, right? It's if promises were dollars, literally in this case, right? But then what happens is people can't afford to buy shit, which means there's nothing to produce. Employers can't make money, so they have to lay people off. Then you get the unemployment. It's the same cycle. And I think on that note, we can kind of transition to our next topic, which is very much related. We're going to talk a little bit about European banking and American banking and the Volcker Rule and our labor standards as they compare to over there, and some things Joe wanted to bring up about that. So let's start about the banking, and then we'll work into the labor, because I think that works in that direction better. So to kind of talk about the Volcker Rule and what that entails. So, of course, Volcker was an economist, I believe in the 1970s, I'm kind of bad with my history on this, who said that basically banks should not be allowed to do what they did between 2000 and 2008. Which, when you frame it that way, just sounds great, right? It's like, yeah, that wasn't cute at all.
No.
But what it entails is essentially what Chinese shadow banks do. So Volcker Rule said that banks should not be able to trade their own securities. So if you loan out a bunch of money to a bunch of businesses, even if you're following the regulations, which no bank does, but let's assume they do, okay? Even if you use third-party brokers and all that, and you have all those securities, you cannot turn around and sell those securities to somebody else, repackaged, and basically do the mortgage swap thing. Or actually, you can do that, but not with anything that's backed by government money. So I'm trying to, this is actually kind of complicated. You can't do it with anything that's backed by the Federal Reserve, that's FDIC insured, that's basically in this government, like Treasury linked pool. So, because the idea is these banks and the shadow banks do exactly the same thing. They do this, and then when they know it's going to fail, but they're a lot less risk averse because they know they'll be able to request a bailout from the government. when it fails, because otherwise it'll wipe out all their assets and it'll wipe out all the people that just plain have money in that bank. I know this is complicated. I know like my knowledge of it isn't 100%, but that's what the Volcker Rule is. So it basically says that you can trade your own securities, but you can't do it to a point where you're exposing people's savings to it. That's the idea. Am I getting this right, Joe?
Sounds about right, yeah.
I mean, yeah. So my outlook on this, on the Volcker Rule, and it's actually, I mean, there have been studies done that show that banks will always fuck up like this. They will always, you cannot trust them not to do this. They're not worried about going bankrupt on their own securities failing, so they're going to do this because, hey, we'll just get a government bailout. And that's exactly what happened. And the rationale for TARP was that if we let the banks fail, Grandma Millie is going to see her CDs evaporate. She's going to see her savings evaporate. We can't have that happen. We can't punish the banks by letting that happen. And it took only about 5 years for them to actually, I mean, the Volcker Rule was part of Dodd-Frank, which was the reform passed right after TARP. And it only took them 5 years to start implementing it. Just, you know, what's 5 years between friends? Right? But
yeah.
My thing is, and of course this is me being Mr. Ultra-Libertarian Austrian economist, we don't need to fix the central bank, we need to get rid of it, is we only need this Volcker Rule because we have banks that are bailed out by the government in the first place, that are insured by the government, that are insured by the central bank. And really, the shadow banks in China have the exact same problem. Where are they getting the initial capital for this? The central bank that's printing it for them, allegedly to grow the economy, but really to blow a bubble. If you had to do that shit with your own money, you probably would have a lot fewer people doing it. So that's kind of my brief take on the Volcker Rule. And what I feel like is happening, and it happened, we kind of, a lot of folks talk about the time between the Great Depression, let's say the 70s, when these banking laws started getting repealed, that this was some great era of equality in the U.S. You had a big compression between incomes of the rich and the poor, and, they attribute this to kind of the banking restrictions. But the problem is, one of the problems with that is, yes, you can accomplish that, but you also really, really stunt growth. Because now no one has any real incentive to invest. So post-World War II, we had a lot of investment in foreign countries where regulations didn't apply. And in the late 50s, early 60s, all these guerrillas start popping up, because people are sick of it. People are sick of us being basically doing what China is doing to their peasants now, all over the world, like in South America and in Asia. And then we're like, oh shit, now we have no economic growth. So we repealed the Volcker Rule and did the whole Great Depression thing all over again, basically, the 1920s all over again, culminating in the 2007 crisis. So my thing is, my suggestion, and I realize Brian Custer's not here to argue with me, that would be great if he were, is that, this is just us alternating between two bad models. And we really need to go back to a pre-Federal Reserve system where there is no central bank. We need to go back to a pre-banking era. So,
how realistic is that in these times, you think?
Well,
with it being so part of how we do things.
I honestly think it's more realistic than it was when it was happening. I mean, one of the reasons for central banking being reintroduced in the U.S., we didn't have it for almost 100 years. Actually, we never had it. We had like one experiment in the 1920s that Andrew Jackson got rid of. That was only for 10 years. We never really had a central bank before that. One of the founding principles of this country was no central banks, and it wasn't a coincidence. That whole separation of church and state, in the medieval era and Enlightenment era, the churches were the banks. The Vatican Bank was a big problem. So, one of the rationales for creating a central bank was, of course, the late 19th century. You have all these frontier banks. There's very little communication. So, any bank could just basically do the pump and dump thing on their own and then just take the money and take off for another state.
Right.
And you cause a huge panic, other banks are exposed, and it was a lower amplitude but higher frequency boom and bust economics. I mean, you heard about the panics, right?
Yeah.
1883, 1887, I want to say, 1895, 1907, you had all these, they didn't call them recessions back then, they called them panics. They're also very short-lasting, though.
Brian would say that that's why the central banking thing was a good thing.
Well, I would say that was the rationale for it. First of all, we already had some banking regulations at the time. We just didn't have them to the the Federal Reserve was a next step. It was not like the banks weren't regulated. Here's my thing, though. Brian does have a point with that. The thing is, what we've done is we've gone from low amplitude, high frequency shakiness to high amplitude, low frequency. We go up, 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 boom. Right? So that's all we've done. It's not like we've created less recessions or basically less boom and bust for economics. We just went from a small wave that's constantly fluctuating to this huge wave that moves slower. And even the gap between the rich and the poor, it looks like in the Gilded Age, the gap between the rich and the poor should be the biggest ever, right? And yet it's like half then of what it is now.
Well,
so
I don't know. It seems I don't know if you intentionally are advocating going back to the frequent crash kind of era. I don't know.
I'm not
in favor of that, but
I'm not advocating that.
I don't know. Those two choices seem like just two different bowls of shit, as Lewis Black said.
Yeah, I agree.
Is there a better way? Maybe is my question. But
what I'm saying is that with modern communications, I think the smaller frequent crashes would be even smaller. Yeah, you would have some fluctuation in economics, but it would not be the panics that you had then for the simple reason that you could not do that and get away. There's nowhere left to go. It's that simple. There's nowhere left to go. If you think about when you have a lower amplitude wave, yeah, you have speculators, and you have people who do that and they steal money like that. Basically, they lie to people and they take off. But there's more of them, and each of them steals less money. Right? Just, that's what makes sense with a lower amplitude wave. Right, Joe? Does that make sense? When you have the large wave, it's because it's one very, very small coalition, one very, very small elite of bankers, whether they're Chinese shadow bankers or Wall Street in the U.S., they're the only ones with the resources to still do this past the regulations. So they get a big wave and then a big crash, and when the big crash happens, we've witnessed that they can evade the law. They can evade I'm not against regulation, by the way. I'm not against the laws saying you can't do this. I'm against proactive regulations trying to stop them from trying because those don't work. So when they do this, lock them up. No problem there.
Well, and actually, you pointed out something I was going to. I think that it's up to just independent of banking theory, which I don't get too deep in because that's not a subject that I've studied. But just looking at this era that we're in I'll just say UK and US right now, but it seems like it's common in basically all the developed Western world that this idea that basically these people have gotten to the point where they're such an important cog in a complicated system. Each individual one of these people can just cloak themselves in that idea and basically are impervious to any kind of consequence for their behavior.
Like Jamie Dimon?
Right, and you can really point at any of these guys, and you have to tip your hat if you're grudgingly envious of how brazen the fuckers at Goldman Sachs are. They basically are just putting up a middle finger to the rest of the world, saying, "Try to fucking stop us."
Exactly.
We'll just figure out some other evil shit to do and make a shit ton of money off all you plebes and run away with it. And I think that at some level, and I'm not advocating revolution, let's say, but I think that at some level, I think part of the problem in the Western civilization, that whole idea of, well, I'm going to be one of them one day, and so it's okay that they're like that now.
We're talking about culture now.
Yeah, and that's what I prefer to focus on because I'm more of kind of a student to me of cultural trends, and I like examining that side of things.
We'll get to that.
We need to demand, I think, as a culture, we need to start demanding more accountability and basically going, no, we're not just, rats in your maze kind of deal. Like, demand better for yourself, and to not think of this as, well, I need to leave that kind of evil doing intact, so when I'm in that position, I can do the same.
Because you're not going to be.
That's just a shitty way to think. A, but B, it's not going to happen. Right? What are the odds? Like, these guys made it, but they're working hard every day to keep you out of that club.
Well, it's almost like, a kind of an analogy would be Mexican drug cartels. Like, you have kids that watch Scarface, and they think, oh yeah, I'm gonna be the next mafia boss.
Which is interesting that happens because the guy fucking gets shot to death at the end. But
yeah, but somehow everyone misses that. He died. Hello? Right.
He dies. He dies like with a white nose because he slammed his head into a garbage bag full of cocaine right beforehand.
And it's not
This is the life you want for yourself?
It's not just him, though. If you look at, like, Mexican drug lords, like Mexican cartel bosses, and these guys are way more powerful than the Mexican government or any tycoon, any semi-legitimate tycoon in Mexico. They get busted all the time. They get shot all the time. They have that life until a rival dealer gets pissed off that he looked at his wife wrong,
right,
and sends someone to put a bullet in his head.
You have that life for like a year, and then you get killed.
Right. But even to make it there, even to get to be El Chapo or the Monkey or one of these guys, think about it. You got 10,000 guys that die trying to get there, right, and one guy that makes it. So if you think you're going to be the next Jamie Dimon, you're right, not. And keep in mind that, Jeffrey Skilling, where's he?
And like I said, that guy must just wake up every day boiling at some of the shit that these guys that are out free as a bird get away with every...
Well, don't worry, they'll end up there.
It's like, motherfucker, I fucking blazed that trail for your ass, and I'm sitting here still in Colorado, still in prison issue, jumper, still not able to get out. I think it's only a couple more years, but...
Yeah, I think they're going to let him out. Yeah, they're going to give him the...
He will breathe free air again, but he's going to be a lot older, and he's not going to be able to go back to what he was.
No, he's done. He's finished. So here's the thing. But again, when you talk about, that being said, Joe, I agree with you. But this is the fundamental divide between you and I. I don't think the culture can change. I don't think culture change, or let me rephrase that. I don't think culture change is implemented through regulations. If you regulate,
no, I'm not saying it is either.
If anything, it's just it just perpetuates that culture, because these regulations make it difficult for the average person to get ahead. They're not aware of this, but that's what happens. And they look at these guys who still got ahead by shirking the regulations and having the resources, the initial resources. A lot of these guys are born with silver spoons in their mouths. It's not like Jamie Dimon, his dad was a banker.
Yeah, Donald Trump, I'm looking in your direction.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
and actually, that says a lot about this country, by the way, that Donald Trump is seen in the very, complimentary kind of oracle-like sense that he's taken for it. I look at that guy and I see this pudgy, fat, bald fucking joke of a human being.
He's dumber than a box of rocks. Have you heard him speak?
But it makes a lot of sense when you analyze this cultural kind of phenomena that I'm talking about. The fact that he's seen as this patron saint of finance and business, and that
success
is what they're aspiring to be. It makes a lot of other things make sense in that light.
Donald Trump could not get a casino license in Las Vegas. He built a casino, he built the Trump Tower, he built a hotel, and he didn't fill out the right paperwork. He couldn't get a license.
There's no casino.
Right, and now it's gone. It's not there anymore because okay, so how fucking stupid do you have to be?
You know what? You're right. That I didn't even think of it last time I went to Vegas. The building is still there, but it doesn't say Trump anymore.
No, I think it's Wynn now. Yeah, they sold it because you couldn't get so. Okay, that's like not being able to get laid in a whorehouse.
Well, this is the guy who...
That's what that is.
A casino in Atlantic City that went bankrupt not once, not twice, but I think it was like 3 times, 4 times. How the fuck... Hang on a sec. Hang on. We're stopping the show for a minute here. How the fuck do you go bankrupt running a casino? This is a business where throngs of moronic tourists in shorts show up in a bus, by car, by plane. They come from hundreds, thousands of miles around to dump their wallets out on the table on red. And they think they're going to win. Every single game in that casino is 55% plus in your favor. How the fuck do you lose money with that? It's a license to print money. You ever seen the movie Casino when they're dumping all the buckets full of money? What the fuck?
No, I hear you. It's like...
How do you go bankrupt doing that?
Yeah, so hopefully we've deterred any of our latent patrons from idolizing Donald Trump. I can't stand that guy. I'm like...
More than once. Not just once. More than once. How the hell?
He's the kind of guy that goes to a whorehouse and still can't get laid. It's that pathetic. Now, that being said, I don't think this culture is going to change by us regulating. Regulations don't fix a culture. China has way stricter regulations than we do. So does Russia. Think, oh, well, there's your anarchy in Russia. No! Their regulations make ours look like nothing. But the culture of corruption will trump, no pun intended, the regulations every single time. That's just, the regulations don't work if no one's following them. And they're not following them because they have a culture of not following them. And the people meant to enforce them don't follow them because they have a culture of shirking them and so forth. It's this shit all the way to the top. And it's basically propped up by a populace that on the one side believes in regulation. Let's not forget that. Actually believes people follow it. And on the other, idolizes these guys that have succeeded not just by beating the system, but by shitting on the system and holding two middle fingers up and saying, you're still going to praise us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we have. So when I say deregulate, all I'm saying is level the playing field. Let other people that weren't born into big money essentially be able to make it legal for them to do what Jamie Dimon does anyway, and let them compete with Jamie Dimon. And yes, it's going to be brutal competition, but you're going to eliminate the bad apples very, very quickly because they have to compete with people. They can't just, they have to rely on something other than their connections and their existing resources which they use to beat the system while everyone else complies with it. Or not complies with it, but has to pretend to comply with it. Let's put it that way.
I want to close this quick financial banking thing and switch to labor with one statement.
Right.
I was one of the few progressive leaning people of the group of friends that I have that was actually against TARP. So let's just put it that way.
Well, actually,
I had a very libertarian opinion of TARP.
and actually, I have become a little bit less hostile to TARP. I'm certainly not for it, but I've had some people show me that you really would have eliminated lots and lots of people, just their life savings, if you've let that go to shit. The thing is, we really needed to lock up the bankers for that.
Well, and that's the thing.
We really needed to put a few people in jail.
Money, and when I say TARP, and you're right. Actually, let's get off on this really quick. Kind of point out, I was against it as it was because as it was basically whatever they need, we will give them on Uncle Sam's dime, and that's it. That was a bad thing. And you're right, if we had maybe kind of picked and choose, then maybe, then we're talking top down. But if we had demanded basically, okay, fine, we'll keep the infrastructure up just so we don't all get fucked, but you're all in jail now. Like, if we did something more like that, if there's actually a consequence to all that, to completely fucking everything up, yeah, then I might have been more in favor of it.
But here's my thing.
It demanded nothing back.
Right. But my whole thing is that the culture that you're describing does not allow for that. It does not validate that.
Well, that's the thing. The guy in charge was a guy who used to be in Goldman at the time, and then the dude who's going to be in charge of regulating is going to end up quitting that job and going and working for a lobbyist for that same bank later on. So that's why. I mean, it's
the same revolving door. But what I'm saying is because, in my opinion, this will never change. The culture will not change. What we need is essentially, since we're not going to lock these guys up, we're relying on these regulations to work and to be deterrents because people believe, if they do that, they'll get locked up, therefore they won't do that. Well, look, they didn't get locked up. So we really can't rely on these regulations. We have to rely on market competition. If they tried to do this and the regulations that put them in power, the Volcker rules and just general finance regulations, if they weren't in place, they couldn't have gotten remotely as far. Yeah, there would have been a lot of smaller bankers competing, and some of them might have done similar shit, but at a much lower amplitude. They would have had a lower market share, and yeah, some of them might have gotten away, others would have gotten. It would also be easier to lock them up because they don't have the same resources and the same power. All we're doing with this is creating a very small elite, and that elite literally gets away with murder because there isn't anyone else. That's where I'm trying to go with this.
Whatever kills too big to fail is good for me. Let's just say that.
So, moving on.
I wanted to move, and when I say labor, I wanted to talk about another specific cultural trend. And there was a commercial for the Cadillac ELR recently that got a lot of attention, some negative attention from some people because it was I think it premiered during the Super Bowl. It was a very kind of America thumping their chest sort of commercial. Oh, we were the country that went to the moon, and we took a car there, and we left it there. Why? Because we were bored, and how, Cadillac is this culmination of American kind of elbow grease and know-how, and it was sort of it was framed as this like "fuck you, Europe" sort of thing, and obviously, really, they meant just the cars, but they sort of were, oh well, we only take 2 weeks off in August a year, and we have more time to work like dogs in afford a Cadillac, I guess, or something was the specific marketing interpretation, but. That as a theme was kind of discussed in a lot of political kind of pundit shows, and I think Maher mentioned it this week in his show. This idea that it's worth bragging over that we work kind of some of the longest hours. Asia tops us. I'm pretty sure that like Japan,
Yeah.
China, some of those they lap.
I don't know about China, but definitely Japan.
In Western countries though. So when I'm saying Western, I mean like UK, Europe, America.
Basically, Europe and Canada.
We work some of the longest hours. Yeah, by numbers, we're the most productive country. But I guess I would say that isn't there maybe a middle ground? I guess what concerns me, and I've seen this. I know somebody who works for a company that actually just merged with a German company, and the thing that was amazing is that some of the American people were actually laughing at some of the German counterparts about how they work and they just take so much time off. The implication being, these guys are lazy compared to us.
They're lazy because they take time to live
because they have time to work. And you see these same people, they're pulling 10-hour days, 12-hour days. These are people with wives and kids, and it's like, how do you do that and have a life other than work? And for me, I guess and we're living in an era now where, the debate about it aside, you have so many people working 2 jobs just to get by, or you have so many families where both parents have to work. It's not before it was like a choice. Oh, mom has a job part-time, ha-ha, in the 50s. Now it's like both parents are working overtime just to pay the bills. These are facts now in America, especially when we're talking about wealth disparity. These are just facts of life. And I guess my question is, isn't this just another one of those things the elite wants to do? It enforces this whole cultural norm of, it's just normal to your life is your job and you don't have any life outside of it. And this whole idea that we pay lip service to a quote-unquote work-life balance, that it's just bullshit that we're just saying.
Well, here's the thing.
Your work-life balance is that 2 hours a day where you're at home waiting to come back here between when you're sleeping and eating and showering and all that other shit. What kind of life is that? And I guess I would ask the average person, is this the kind of life you really want? As a culture, should we be aspiring to work like dogs endlessly and never have time off, have some of the lowest amounts of paid time off? And we don't have any required vacation like Europe does. We don't have the same amount of paid days off for holidays. It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? We don't have any time to enjoy life itself, to me, it seems like. And now it's not just a thing that there's some go-getters out there that just their life is their job. There was always people like that, but now it's like expected of you, it seems like, to some degree.
Well, there's there's a lot that you said, so let me address some of it piece by piece. First of all, one thing I have a really hard time believing in, ever, and this has nothing to do with which ideological side you take, is that an elite creates the culture. I feel the culture creates the elite, and the elite is the product of the culture, and not vice versa. Jamie Dimon would be in jail if we had more people that advocated for him being in jail. Just food for thought for all of you out there.
Well, that's what I was getting at earlier. But yeah, you're right. No, that's yeah.
So here's the thing. I think one huge issue, and this is kind of an aside to everything you said. You didn't mention it, but it is definitely a huge part of what you're describing, is our penchant for debt. See, in America, we have this idea that you are entitled to everything right now. Donald Trump, it's like that scene from Borat. I get clock radio, he cannot afford clock radio. Great success. I mean, he's not making fun of the Kazakhs in that, folks. That's not who he's making fun of in that movie. This is ridiculous, is that we have this culture of acquisition. It's not a culture of materialism. Don't get it twisted.
The old saying is keeping up with the Joneses. Yeah.
Yes.
Or as George Carlin put it, your neighbor gets a dildo that plays "Oh Come All Ye Faithful." You want one too.
No, it's divided there, but yeah, exactly. So, because we're constantly buying shit that we can't afford. And actually, this is something, maybe because I didn't grow up in this country until I was 10 years old, I don't buy it. I'm like, no, I don't want to buy that. Yeah, it's nice, but I can't afford it. Oh, just put it on your credit card. No! Then I have to pay twice what it costs for it. So we have this idea that if you don't have it, just borrow the money and pay for it and have it anyway. You only live once. Yeah, well, I want to live into my 50s, people. And if you're working 2 jobs and you don't eat and you don't know your kids, You see the problem there? But hey, I got the latest iPad. So what we have, I think a lot of the reason Americans end up in that situation is because they bog themselves down with debt. So the bills they're paying are not bills, they're debts. And more importantly than that, I feel like when you have everyone doing this, that creates its own inflation. If everyone on your block borrowed money to upgrade their house, now you have to borrow money to upgrade your house or not upgrade your house. You can't save up enough to upgrade your house because they just blew up the prices of upgrading your house because they all did it on debt. You see what I'm saying? These credit bubbles are a huge part of this. And, I don't think we're aware of them as a culture. But that's what it is. And if you look at Europe, they really do not have the same penchant for debt. They're very cautious about borrowing money. And I don't know if that's really the case in the UK, but even like whether it's Southern Europe or Northern Europe, there's debt, but just their debt ratios of just individual debt and business debt and household debt compared to the US is very, very small. So that's I think feel like one part that we have.
Let me bust that one a little.
Sure.
Right, more than a little.
I like it when you bust stuff I say, Joe, so please do.
From 1973 to 2011, worker productivity grew 80%, while median hourly compensation, adjusted for inflation, grew by 1/8 that amount. So that, I guess, is a part of it. The cultural trend merging with an economic trend. That's kind of concerning.
But I feel like these are two sides of the same coin.
Isn't debt, though, but like if you indict people for debt, isn't that a product of the fact that they're not earning what they should be to keep up?
Should is a very, very interesting term. I could flip this around and say people are not demanding to be paid more because they go and max out their credit card instead of spending money that they have. This is a macro trend.
Well, I think we're arguing which is the chicken and which is the egg, though, aren't we?
There isn't. These two things feed off each other. I'm not saying the trend you're describing isn't real. I'm saying that's a huge factor that people...
But it does sound like you're blaming a wage trend that's coming from the top down on the consumer end of it entirely, though.
I'm not saying I'm blaming it. What I will disagree with is that it's coming from the top down. And this is where we get back into your main argument with productivity versus labor. Now, of course, Europe is big on unions. Now, as I've mentioned multiple times on the show, my view on unions is neutral. I dislike a specific class of unions, and that's government employee unions, because they're completely insulated from the check of competition. But when it comes to trade unions or worker unions or any kind of private unions, I think these are neutral entities. They're economic, self-interested organizations, and it's perfectly fine for them to advocate for their workers, and if they get out of control and they're demanding too much, they get slammed by competition. They put their employer out of business, their employer fires the union and hires non-union workers. That's all fine and dandy. That's part of the competitive market model.
Footnote, union participation has never been lower, and wage disparity has never been higher. So, yeah, it's interesting.
They basically don't have unions in this country anymore. The unions
it's very small. It's like 8% now, yeah.
It's not even that. Most of those are government employee unions. That's a completely different animal. I don't even want to talk about those. Those aren't unions, really.
There's only a few like professional unions I could think of, like pilots and stewardesses, auto manufacturing, teachers, which are a public employee. I guess you would count that. And the Food and Commercial Workers Union, there's not that many. I think obviously the Teamsters are still there, AFL-CIO is still there, but yeah, when you think of the slice of the pie, it's a lot smaller than it used to be.
So now, if we look at Europe and the way they're organized over there with their unions, specifically, most importantly, I would say Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, and France and Spain to a lesser extent. Yes, union power is huge there, and it's not just unions; it's like coalitions of unions and coalitions of coalitions of unions. The unions are very well united. Now, any union person, any union advocate will tell you that's what you have to do. Get all the workers together. You fuck with one of us, you have to fuck with us all. Yeah, that's great. 1917 called. They want their philosophy back. Problem with that is now you're again insulating yourself against competition. So if you look at a lot of the issues they have, particularly in Southern Europe, and you mentioned some, we'll get into specific productivity numbers, but you notice how countries like Greece and Italy don't come anywhere close to like the productivity of Northern Europe or the US or the UK? It's because what you're talking about, time off of work and compensation, it's the other extreme. People know that they're going to have their wage stream the workers, anyone that basically has a job and is union, has no real incentive to be productive. Now, there has to be a middle ground. I'm not saying unions are bad. I'm not saying, oh, workers are naturally lazy. But if you have a job where you can come in every single day, sit there with your dick in your hand, and you're not going to get fired, and your chances of being promoted or getting any kind of increase are also very low. Your wage is comfortable, but there's very little capacity for you to get ahead because it's all about union seniority and not really about your performance. You're not going to do anything. Well, why would you? People work out of self-interest. They don't work to contribute to society. It's all crap. The USSR tried that. They failed. Get over it. So this is the other extreme. And what I hear when I hear people complaining about European lack of productivity and that people are lazy, I feel like there is some truth to that. It's just we're on the other side of that equation. We're not better than them. We just have the opposite problem. For example, before the show we were having this conversation, you brought up Norway. Well, Norway is an interesting country because it's probably the resource richest country in the world, and it has 5 million people. Now, they can afford to be lazy. Their efficiency is complete crap. It's just that they have so much and so few people. They have that privilege. Countries that are actually comparable to even like a larger U.S. state, they don't. So, where I'm talking about middle ground, and this is kind of where I was going with this, addressing all this. And again, I think people already know where I'm going to go with this, but maybe they don't see the connection. Is the problem is centralized organization. So, in Europe, in Southern Europe, most people are in a union. The union makes all the decisions as far as productivity goes, as far as compensation. There's no real individual competition. There's no room for real individual promotion, individual success. So everyone just sits on their ass and winks it, and nothing gets done. In the U.S., on the other hand, it's not really the dog-eat-dog world that a lot of anti-capitalists want to paint it as. It's that you have basically a lack. We have a lack of capacity, actual opportunity to succeed, but you have a culture that directs you away from success. It sells you success with something that isn't. Whether it's, like you said, keeping up with the Joneses, that whole idea, or just, work hard, get ahead. It's like, no, that's not true. So, and it tells you to get away from unions for the same reason. Oh, well, unions will fuck you over. It's like, we really need to go back to smaller organizations, smaller businesses, smaller unions that compete with each other. Do you see what I'm saying?
It may. Like I said, I just want to. My main thing was commenting on the cultural thing, and a measure we were talking about earlier, which you can explain this for our patrons. Maybe this GDP. In parentheses, PPP per hour worked. The PPP being the purchasing power parities, which is just sum up for our listeners.
Well, it's a very complicated measure, and it basically takes into account the power of their currency, just as opposed to just their GDP. So, like you have your GDP, let's say in your own currency, but you have to translate it into dollars in order for it to be comparable. But what's your actual exchange rate? So that's one factor. It takes away, I think you said it does not include hours worked.
And it doesn't include hours worked per week or unemployment.
Right. So in the U.S., okay, I would imagine that our PPP is very high.
Right.
Well, one, because
we're
we are
third on that list under Norway, under Luxembourg.
Right. Well, for one, and again, Luxembourg has about 5 people in it. Now, for one, the U.S., the dollar is our currency. And that's the world's that's the kind of the current global gold standard. So that artificially shoots up our PPP. But I feel like more importantly, we're efficient in this country. This is kind of where I was trying to go with it earlier, and I don't feel like I made this point very well. We're efficient, but we don't benefit from the efficiency of our own work.
Correct.
Whereas in Europe, they're not efficient, so no one benefits. I don't see how one is really better than the other.
Isn't Germany? Wouldn't you say Germany's known as being pretty efficient?
Okay,
overall, though?
Right. See, everyone always brings up.
We're number 3, they're number 7, so it's not a big gulf between us.
Everyone always brings up Germany, and Germany, yes,
Germany twice the time off period that we do, so that's why I like to bring them up.
Well, twice, honestly, isn't a whole lot. That's fine.
If you told me right now I could make the same money and get twice the time off, I'd take it.
I agree.
Hey.
What I'm saying is, in comparative terms, to places like Greece or Norway, that's nothing.
Well, I
Or
don't know. I was
Sweden.
reading about Greece. They get about the same. It was maybe a week longer. It's not that much.
Okay, now, when I talk
Like
about
5 to 6 weeks, I think.
Hold on. When I talk about paid time off, I don't mean their actual vacation hours that they accrue. I'm talking about how many days out of the year are workers not at work and getting paid. I believe I remember reading that in Norway, this is Thomas Sowell, which is one of my favorite economists. It's like the last
Like a
Austrian
sick day or a fuck off day or whatever.
anything that you're at work, not at work, holidays also, but you're getting paid.
Right.
And in Norway, this is mind-boggling. It's 1 out of 8 work days on average per worker. That figure.
Sweet, I'm moving right now.
Now, no, you're not, because they won't let you into Norway. Okay, that's the thing. Norway understands how lucrative they are. There's a patron of ours that lives in Norway. I'm going to have you talk to him.
I have a special thing that I could do just for myself to get myself in there.
Well, you yourself, okay, but I'm talking about in general. Now, here's the thing. Again, Norway has the resources that they can afford that. If we had that here in this country, our economy would collapse. It's that simple. We cannot afford that lack of productivity. And countries that have similar measures, not quite as bad as Norway. Norway is by far in the back of the line on that. They end up with the situation that Greece and Italy and Spain are in. Now, I'm not saying that's the only factor by a long shot, but that's part of it. Now, let's talk about kind of Northern Europe, not Scandinavia, but Germany, for example, or Austria. Those countries, it's interesting. I would say that they have some of the best balance between these two things in the world. They do have, they're productive. They're more productive than places like Greece or Norway, per capita, by a long shot. Productive, efficient. But they also remember to have a life. Right. And they also have a lot of that, no, not all of it, but they have a significant amount of that wealth and that productivity distributed back to the people actually doing the work. Now, what's the difference? What's kind of the factor, in my opinion, between the U.S. and Germany? In my opinion, this is again, my background is in sociology and social science, political science, not in economics. So this is kind of what I look for. The difference, to me, is the cultural homogeneity. There's a reason it was Germany that was the country that, where eugenic socialism really took off, and they went to try to conquer the world using it, and Japan was the other big one. Those two countries, arguably, are the most homogeneous on the planet. Everyone looks the same. Everyone speaks the same language. Everyone basically has very similar values, similar religious outlooks, similar outlooks on life, similar outlooks on work, on family. They do not have the diversity of China or the U.S. Well, Norway is very small, so they're difficult to compare.
I guess when you're talking differences like hair color and the fact that you're a Jew or not, that was all they had.
Well, hair color, right.
Wow.
Right, and again, the reason for that, really, I think, one of the reasons Hitler had to pick on the Jews.
Splitting hairs, huh?
Right, you really had to pick someone, and also Jews were living all over Europe. They weren't just in Germany.
Right.
It was a class to isolate. But again, historically, except for that one hiccup with Hitler, Germany has been one of the most tolerant countries in the world. The reason all the Jews were in Germany and Austria is because that's where this Inquisition could not reach them 500 years earlier, because all those kings and dukes in Germany and Austria said, no, fuck you. Get the fuck out of here. Go back to Spain. Go back to Italy. We don't want you here. We're going to let people live in peace here. Now, that was that. That was a hiccup, and it really didn't last all that long. So, yeah, that's kind of what Germany, we think of Germany and we think of Hitler, but no, historically, Germany is not like that at all. I've been to Germany. It's, it's very, it's kind of strict, but it's very friendly. It's not hostile. In Eastern Europe is way more hostile in this sense, like we're seeing in Ukraine right now, in Poland.
The thing I hear comedians always talk about is that how they're accused of having no sense of humor in Germany, and really it's just that they step on jokes all the time because they don't want someone busting out a Holocaust joke unexpectedly. It's like, yeah, I guess if I had the Holocaust, I'd do nothing but step on jokes too. Just idea.
I don't know if that's really the case. Honestly, I've known a few Germans, just students that have been in school with me, and they have a great sense of humor. They're very calm, they're very polite, they're very nice people. It's really we have this misconception that Germans are Hitler. And Hitler wasn't even German, he was Austrian.
Austrian, yeah.
So we're on the same page. And he came from one of the most like from a one-horse town where everyone was inbred.
Yeah, it was like Austria, let's say like Tombstone, Arizona was America back in.
It was not a representative sample.
No.
Yeah, so it's
from like a bumwater town in Alabama being representative of America or something. Yeah.
Well, hold on. Well, there was one from Texas like that happened with.
Oh Jesus.
Anyway,
let's pause for a second. Let's not give him the credit of being called a fucking Texan. He's a northeast, blue-eyed devil like the rest of them from Maine.
Okay, well,
to be honest.
by that
you like playing cowboy out there in Texas in my ranch at Crawford and had Barney digging a hole. Yeah, right. Whatever. Stop. Just stop.
More or less.
Not Reagan. Okay, get over it.
I agree with you.
City meetings and galleries. Yeah.
And that's a different show, but I agree with you. So the same. So going back to our kind of cultural debate here. Those cultures, Japan, and of course Japan worked themselves to the bone, and they're extremely productive, extremely efficient, and they do get some of the economic benefit. They just kill themselves health-wise with.
They're the one country that consistently way outpaces us in hours worked. Yet they're less productive.
They're not. They have. It's also there's cultural reasons for inefficiency.
They have quantity over quality.
Agreed. But here's the thing: the homogeneity of those cultures. You can actually make regulations, and you can actually set cultural standards people will follow, because everyone has the same culture. And interestingly, those two cultures, Germany and Japan, not only are they homogeneous, those probably the only two cultures in the world that are actually cultures of following rules. Think about that. The United States, we're absolutely the last culture of following rules. If you were to make that, we would be dead last. The U.S. is all about
fuck you for throwing a rule in my way.
Right.
I'll just show you how to break it. Yeah.
We're all rebels. We're all hyper individualists. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think our public policy and our economic policy has to account for that. You think that places like Russia or Mexico or even India, where you have just lawlessness and corruption and all that those places are basically less prone to rules than we are, but they aren't. They have cultural rules. No one follows the laws. But they have very strong cultural norms. Whereas over here, you can literally almost get away with doing anything as long as you say, fuck you, I don't care about your cultural standards. In Russia or in Mexico and India, you would get shot doing that. Literally, you would get shot doing that. Now, there's places in the U.S. where you'd get shot doing that with specific cultural standards, but still, what I'm saying is our individual liberty here, it really is unparalleled. And I take pride in that as an American. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But I think that when we make public policy, we have to take that into consideration. In Germany, they really aren't big on individual liberty. They're okay surrendering certain freedoms to have an efficient set of rules that works for them. Now, it's great for anyone, except for someone that's like, you know what, I don't like this. This sucks. I want to be able to do whatever I want. And it's just, you won't be able to do that in Germany. And like I said, and again, this comes from talking to people that are social work professionals and sociologists in Germany who've come to study, but they went back to Germany. And they're like, the stuff people do here, if you did this in Germany, it's not even illegal. You would just look so stupid, and you'd be shamed so much that you just would not, you wouldn't be able to do it. You wouldn't be able to, it would be too costly and not beneficial enough for you.
Maybe, and I'm not saying I wholeheartedly agree with that, because I really don't wholeheartedly agree with almost anything, but without getting too deep in the sociological discussion, I think the one thing that I would say just for myself is, I think America, sometimes there's other countries that err too much on the law and order, but then there's countries like us that err too much on just have the idea of catering to everyone's whims all the time and having that be a good thing. Maybe that's not in total.
Well,
I don't know.
Okay. And there's costs and benefits.
Do whatever I want. It's like, well, if whatever you want is murdering 50 people, then maybe it's not a good thing. You just use an extreme example, or people use that to rationalize, like you were saying earlier, of just blatantly fucking people over financially or something. If you're Jamie Dimon or whatever, well, I can do whatever I want. I can see where that could be a dangerous idea in some circumstances.
Yeah, so. It's a cost benefit analysis, obviously. There's one thing I wanted to bring up. If you think about Karl Marx, where was he from?
Was he from Germany?
German, of course. He was a German.
He was
not an Austrian, a German. And he's a German Jew, but he's a German.
Right.
And his whole idea of communist society that a lot of, if you actually read the Communist Manifesto and the way it was, the USSR tried to implement it, or China or North Korea, public shame and common values were a huge check on individuals shirking the system. Well, it was written for Germany. It wasn't written for the USSR. This is an important piece because and I think communism is completely insane and could never succeed anywhere, just around the same page.
It's funny, it ended up being applied to half of Germany, but anyhow.
Yeah, and it actually worked. And still, of the Soviet bloc, East Germany and Poland were the only two countries with even remotely any kind of success. Everything else was just...
Poland did pretty well under the Soviet...
Poland was, of all those countries, it was the most independent of the Soviets, interestingly enough, just historically speaking.
Right.
So, yes, it was part of the bloc, but
East Germany lagged West Germany in terms of growth, in terms of economic performance.
Absolutely.
It still does, actually. There's remnants of that. It seemed like it did a lot better than, let's say, the Romanias or Estonias of the world.
Oh, God, yeah. And I remember, being a little small child in the USSR, and seeing this shame culture. And when I was 5 years old, I knew it was failing, because this top-down, we're going to shame you for not complying with these values shit doesn't work when the person telling you that doesn't believe in those values. The values of Eastern Europe are very, very different from those of Germany. It's a lot of kind of, Greek, Eastern Orthodox influence, a lot of kind of pagan superstition going on there. And, it's not Central Europe, it's Eastern Europe, it's different. So what I feel like the takeaway here, and a lot of the stuff you're saying, Joe, I agree with, is you kind of have to cater your public policy to the culture in existence. You're not going to change the culture with public policy. And when you talk about, our productivity, I feel like people unionizing in this country, we're not going to have the unions that Southern Europe has, and that's a good thing. But if more people looked at unions in a practical manner and said, hey, I don't need to be Mr. Big Socialist waving a red flag union steward, that's stupid. But I can say, hey, being in a union benefits me. And I'm an employee in a private corporation. Being in a union benefits me. I'm going to go around to other people. I'm not going to spin this ideological bullshit. I'm going to explain to them the benefits of being in a union. We're going to form a union. And we're not going to go there and throw shit at our employer. We understand our employer provides our job, but we're going to negotiate for better hours and better wages. That's how it's supposed to be. And, a lot of the problem, of course, in this country, we had corporatism before we had the rise of unions. Correct. So unions had to go the government route because corporations had already gone the government route.
Right, and like we pointed out, in fact, in a lot of examples back in the 1910s, 1920s, had explicit government help. Literally, the Army National Guard was there guarding. The strike zone would be there to break up the strike. In a lot of that'd be more
like 1880s, 1890s, but yes.
No. The coal miners' strike in the early 1990s, 1920s, that was government too.
Okay, I mean, yeah,
the War of Tennessee, I think it's called, or some shit like that.
Well, it was going on for a long time, so I believe you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I feel like one of the costs of our hyper-individualism here is we don't actually put any weight on the kind of the practicality or the objective reasoning of what you're saying. If some dumbass wants to run down the street screaming that the world's going to end and the lizard aliens are coming to take over,
yeah,
there's always going to be someone, and I'm like, dude, you're an idiot. Shut up, stop. No, I'm not saying it's illegal for you to do what you're doing. But it's legal. Yeah. Right, but it's legal for me to say you're a fucking moron. But there's always going to be some whiny third person saying, no, man, he's just expressing himself and shit. That's the problem. Yeah, and I'm expressing myself.
Knee-jerk back the other way. Yeah, I dislike all knee-jerks in any direction. So.
Right, and I'm going to say no, and I'm expressing myself saying he's an idiot. So, in Europe, though, it's not as if this is any better in Europe. It's just that the person it's just everyone's waving the same ideological flag. Well, not everyone, that's extreme, but a lot more people are waving the same ideological flag. That doesn't make it more efficient or more effective. Whereas over here, everyone's waving a different ideological flag. Neither side is really looking at it from an empirical perspective and saying, okay, how do we actually make this work? Maybe the person waving the flag will have to put their flag down because it's not really doing anything. They have to save the flag for the weekends. But how do we make this work? That's not a question a lot of people are asking. They're all asking, how do I make my flag the flag of the country?
Yeah, I think that might be a good note to wrap up on.
Yeah, I think we're good on that. I mean, there's definitely a couple of follow-up shows that we may need to do for different things that we've mentioned.
Yeah, we're all backed up from being off, because we've done like once a month the last 2 months?
I'd say not every 3 weeks.
We're like 2 shows in the hole right now. So.
Right, so we do have a lot to talk about, and you'll hopefully be hearing a lot more of us. And please tell your friends, tell your family, promote us, share us, tweet us. We need the virality. We've been getting, a surprising amount of complaints that we haven't been consistent, and it's very inspiring to us. It's very motivating to us that people are actually listening. They actually want to hear what we're saying. They actually want to read what we're writing.
It wasn't you guys. It was us. We just had.
It really is.
In the last, and I had to go to Texas. I had to.
Right, because George Bush called you himself when he said, come have a drink with me, Joe.
Yeah, and I looked at his horrible paintings and told him, suck! No, I'm just kidding.
There you go.
Didn't do that, but I would have.
In any case. And he doesn't know a Picasso from a train wreck, so in any case. It's very motivating to us, and we're kind of in that weird spot where we can't make a job out of this yet. So we do have bills to pay. We're Americans that have to work to pay our bills and all that.
Yeah.
We do have to earn money. We do have lives outside of this. But we're getting to the point where we're getting, people are asking us to be consistent, and we do have followers and patrons. So it's great. We're working on it. If you want to help us, if you want us to be more consistent, we do ask you to do your part. We do ask you to promote. It has been happening. Please keep doing it. Please keep telling your friends, relatives, neighbors, anyone you think would be interested about it. And we will be, we will be more consistent, and we'll do our part. So thank you for being with us. I'm Neurotoxin.
I'm Dorian. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show at edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at edgeofchaosshow. We can be found on Facebook at facebook.com/The Edge of Chaos. Neurotoxins blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, fyg.blogspot.com. My blog can be found at joeryansworld.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.
Florida. Look, there's a stereotype, cliche hack bit, if you will, that a lot of comedians do about, Florida's just America's dick. It's America's dick hanging down. Get it? Looks like a dick. America's dick. That's wrong. That's offensive. Florida's not America's dick. Florida is America's kind of drooping, descending in the humid heat nutsack. Just this long scrotum. Just a southern scrotum. It's a fucking scrotum. It's a scrotum. And I'm not saying that Florida is a scrotum because I was in Miami for 3 weeks last year and it sucked. I was, and it did. But I have given Florida every fucking chance. I've been all over that state. When I say it's a scrotum, it's because I've been teabagged with that state. I've been all over it. I've been to Orlando, Jacksonville, Gainesville, Tallahassee, Hollywood, Daytona, Fort Lauderdale, Captiva Island, West Palm Beach, all over that goddamn thing. Florida is a vestigial sac. It's a anatomical sac that America's testosterone and anger drains into. And everyone in Florida, like if you go out with your friends, a group of you, and subconsciously, non-verbally, you just elect an alpha. Who's going to run things tonight? What bar are we going to? Where are we going to eat? And you're happy that there's an alpha for one night. I'm just going to relax and kick back. Florida, it's all alphas. Everyone, men, women, black, white, gay, straight, Jews, and Cubans are all alphas. And they're all fighting for dominance. They have to win everything. And it's so ugly, everything. It's just, all right. One day, I was in Miami, and I went walking up Collins Avenue to look at the gorgeous old Art Deco hotels, because I wanted to see something pretty for 10 fucking minutes. So I'm walking along, and who comes down the sidewalk? These two weightlifter dudes in their short shorts, and those weightlifter shirts that are like a towel, basically, that is cut into a shirt so the sides open so you can see the meat display. And these guys, they're just like on a bus is safari, yeah. And they're walking along, and they look gayer than the pickup truck full of gay guys that's cruising alongside of them. 2 in the cab, 4 in the back, going, woo! Yeah! Like, just hooting at these guys. So one of the weightlifter douchebags stops, and he turns to the pickup truck. And he goes, hey, we're not gay, all right? Then one of the guys in the back of the pickup truck says, it's still an ass, motherfucker! Did I just witness a straight hate crime?